The Chicago Race Riot of 1919 and the project that we've created is largely unknown. And so one of the primary reasons we created this project is because it's so wildly unknown. Here we are on the lakefront. If we stopped 100 people, 99 would have never heard of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919. But that was the worst incident of racial violence in the history of the city of Chicago. On a hot Sunday afternoon on July 27th, when a white man on a beach started throwing rocks at these kids because they had swam essentially into a body of water that was considered white. Yeah? And so for the crime, quote unquote, of swimming while black, these kids were attacked, right, by this white man, and Eugene Williams, age 17, died. Right? As a result of his killing and then the failure of the police to arrest the killer, rumors spread, tensions increased, and that night, July 27th, white gangs invaded the predominantly black neighborhood, then known as the Black Belt, now called Bronzeville, and the riot had begun. The project that we've created is intended to sort of remember this history that's been totally forgotten because it totally shapes the city of Chicago today. We call the 1919 riots the origin story of segregation in Chicago. So by creating a series of markers installed at the locations where each of the 38 people were killed, we hope to force people to confront people with this history, right? So that they remember this history that continues to impact us today.
And for me, with the work that I do, it's important to use this project as a way to raise up awareness around the structural mechanisms that are tied to the origin story, as Peter mentioned, the Chicago Race Riot. So how physical violence was used to contain, how the lack of justice impacted communities of color, and how that connects to today as well. And so work that we do partnering with a lot of community-based organizations that serve many youth, want to partner with them using our project where they begin to uncover this story as well, but also begin to challenge the themes that are connected almost 102 years later regarding the lack of justice and also equitable distribution of resources.
One project in particular in Germany is called Stoppersteiner, which in German means stumbling stones. This is an example of one. It's called a Stopperstein. And so what basically these are is that you're walking down the streets of German cities and you come across embedded into the sidewalks one or multiple of these markers outside of the last known residences of Holocaust victims. In the American context, and in Chicago specifically in 1919, the situation was a bit different. While Eugene Williams was killed, really murdered, simply for being black in the wrong place at the wrong time, black people fought back, actually. It's one of the more interesting aspects of this history, because in many so-called race riots in America, that wasn't the case. All the people killed were black.
The issue is around the lack of justice, right? You have African-American men who were fighting over in France as a part of World War I. How could their service to the United States help serve their own efforts towards equitable justice, equitable humanity? And with that, there's a spirit now, well, how is it that we're fighting for democracy overseas, but we don't have equal access to democracy and justice here? And part of this movement was around resistance. You know what? No longer are we going to, as Claude McKay, a Jamaican poet, describes, stand idly by. We're going to fight. We're going to resist.
We intentionally did not use the word victims. We don't use the word victims because we believe it's an incorrect term to describe all 38, right? Instead, we settled upon the word commemoration.
Thought about partners at Firebird Community Arts because they work with youth who have penetrating traumatic injuries, and they teach them glass blowing as a way to have a creative space for trauma recovery. And so from there, we naturally reached out to Firebird Community Arts to see if they would be interested in using their youth that are involved in Project Fire to be our artists to fabricate that art. Project Fire have begun creating prototypes. Some of the prototypes include prototypes of the shape of a brick, and youth had explained that a brick was important because it was also instrumental in terms of the type of violence that happened. So ultimately, how can we take and partner through this process to elevate awareness around the role of the Chicago Race Riots? One community-based organization that grew out of this coalition was Organic Oneness, that really focuses on social equity and justice. And so quite naturally, given their capacity to put on great events, they seem like the ideal candidate to help us mobilize community residents and organizations and other institutions to tell this story.
In 2020, George Floyd was murdered, and Americans around the country, but also humans around the world, rose up in the largest waves of protests against racism and violence against Black people and people of color, actually in the history of the country and the world. 400 years of racism, of slavery, of segregation, of violence continues to impact African Americans and other people of color. Honestly, the white majority still needs to hear these stories, right? Like, Black people don't really need to be told that America's unfair. Honestly, it's the non-Black population that has to sort of acknowledge this and own it in ways that we have failed to do as a society up until now.
One quote I wanted to share that one of the Firebird Community Arts youth from Project Fire shared was, "Did the race riots ever really end?" And so I think that it's that level of critical analysis and awareness that we want to promote, that we're hoping that we can mobilize to begin to make some systemic changes in Chicago.